What's your origin story? All superheroes and villains, they have them, that defining moment that really shapes who they are. Well, we as God's people, we actually have a shared origin story. Unfortunately, most of Christianity for the last 1,500 years has relied on the wrong origin story. We started the story in Genesis 2. You know the moment Eve and Adam in the Garden of Eden with a certain bite of a certain forbidden fruit that led to what's called the doctrine of original sin, a theology that says this moment changed human nature and that now our starting place, our default setting is sin. But original sin is not where we begin. Because the actual story of God begins in Genesis 1, with God creating all things, calling each created thing good, and then on top of that, offering 3 specific blessings. This is our origin story. It doesn't deny the curse and the sin that follows, but we begin in blessing. Our origin story of blessing, which shapes who we are, and it is time for us to reclaim this, especially now when the effects of the last 2 years of a global pandemic have left us so lost and disoriented, while conflict and war rages in Ukraine, while we face the current racial reckoning, and while we each weather our own loss and fear and exhaustion. Especially now, as we find ourselves in the season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, which is always a time to stop and enter the desert wilderness journey of Jesus, where his own forming of who he is and what he is to do is an invitation for us to let our own wilderness form us too. And this Lent at Salt House, we let our current wilderness draw us back into our origin story, our original blessing that is not dependent on who we are or what we do, but it is who we are and it is what we do. To get there, these Sundays in Lent, we'll trace the beginnings of this theme that carries through the entire Bible, the theme of blessing and curse. We'll walk through the 3 blessings of Genesis 1, then into Genesis 2 to understand the curse. We'll hear a Salt House story from one of our own. We'll trace blessing and curse through the rest of Genesis, then connect it to Jesus' ministry, leading us to Palm Sunday and Holy Week, where together we walk the great descent into Jesus' death on Good Friday, only to rise again on Easter Sunday. Surprise! Into the blessing of new life on the other side. And so, friends, we take a deep breath now, calling to mind and being honest about the other origin stories that we have been told and that we carry. You know the ones I'm talking about, those false stories of needing to perform and perfect and prove ourselves, so that through our Lenten journey, God would rewrite our origin story, forming us as God's blessing for our hurting world. So let's relearn it together now, our original blessing.
Hey, everybody. I am Pastor Ryan, if I didn't introduce myself earlier, and I love good stories. Are you like me, like you find yourself in the car, listening to This American Life or Moth Radio Hour, just like weeping in the driveway, just like, running the battery down? That is me. I love a good story because stories really shape us, right? Stories shape us. And so we have a core value here at Salt House, that stories matter. And so we take time, in this space, in this proclamation space, to hear Salt House stories from amongst us here. And today is a special day because Peder Brakke is telling his story today. This is a man who I think if you were to ask people, like, hey, tell me one thing about this guy, I know this would come up. They might not use this word, but they would get at this word, that Peder is a blesser. This guy is a blesser. He knows how to bless people. They might say like, oh, he's really encouraging or something like that. But we're using this language of blessing. We're trying to get to it. And we're trying to get to it not just kind of like in a theoretical way. We're trying to get to it in life. Like, what does that look like in life? And that's why Peder's going to bring us into a piece of his story. It's not the whole of his story, right? He's just going to give us a piece of his story today. And so what sacred ground we walk on when people share their stories with us, right? What sacred ground. So because of that, Peder, we want to invite you up and pray for you as you bring your story to us here. Will you extend your hands out towards Peder in a sign of blessing? Great God, we give you so much thanks for Peder. Because when he tells his story, when he's vulnerable, it gives us access to our stories in new ways. Even if our stories are different, he gives us access to our stories. And he gives us access to your good story, God. So we give you thanks for the courage of Peder. We give you thanks for the vulnerability of Peder. And brother, we call you good. You're good. You're good. Amen to that?
Amen. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. I'm on, yes? Okay, good. I have a lot of this written down because I think being in our story, sometimes writing stuff down and then just going through it really helps. So for me, it'll help a lot. Exiting high school, I lacked hope for a fatherly presence. The title father for me was synonymous with absence. And for the most part, my memories were void of his formal presence. A big hit, throwing out that guy at second, mastering a fireman's carry or an ankle pick. Any wrestlers out there? Earning enough paper route funds to buy my own bike, graduating from 6th grade, graduating from junior high, learning to drive a stick shift, walking across the gym floor doing homecoming to receive a crown, absent. I knew my dad would show up as I graduated high school, but I wasn't sure what to do with him in that space, in my community, in my friendships. Everyone else who played an informal role was still around, so what was I to do when my dad walked into that space? I wasn't sure how to act, so while I wanted him there in a big way, I didn't know that I wanted him there in other ways. He wasn't present in other victories or milestones, so why this one? And what about all the crappy things? Breaking my arm in 4th grade, it was my baseball coach, the kind, gentle, humble, throwing Samoan Jack Thompson, who splinted my arm and waited with me until my mom got off work. When I was vomiting into an airplane bag in 5th grade, it was my chaperone, the grossed out flight attendant who pinched her nose and pulled herself together to comfort me. And in middle school, my wrestling arch nemesis, he sliced my eyeball down the middle with his fingernail. No lie. I had no idea that blood-red tears existed and could come out of your eyes, but here it was, single dropping down onto my cheek. And it was my mom who drove me to the ER as I sat in the passenger seat, in my adolescent self, prematurely dejected and strategizing how I could continue sports while being blind in one eye. He was absent. He knew nothing of my first kiss, first signs of puberty, first beer, first girlfriend, first fight, first run-in with law enforcement. I was never looking for him in the stands or in the driveway, and I was never looking for his comfort. Did I wish it was there? Absolutely yes. Did I ever think it was a reality or that it would be possible? No. He was absent. It was my mom that taught me how to tie a tie and mow the lawn. It was my mom that set boundaries and set examples. It was my mom that believed in me and provided structure in a safe home. It was my mom that protected me and stuck up for me. It was my mom that loved me unconditionally and I knew she would never leave me. It was my mom that taught me how to be a man, not my father. He was absent. Aside from sushi restaurants and trips to visit his family in Minnesota, I only have one solid memory of my dad at a single baseball game in 8th grade. And all I remember is the advice he was attempting to give me that landed like a sack of failure on my soul. I only have the memory because I have a photo of what looks like Dr. Brakke showing me how to hold a bat correctly. After 8 years of playing this sport, he shows up with advice. He had not earned the right in my life to give any sort of critique. I listened because I admired his legend and I wanted his approval. I needed it and I would work for it. But man, at the time, F that guy. Show up a little bit first and then throw in your 2 cents. So I didn't care if he showed up for graduation, but I also cared a great deal. I needed him to be proud. I needed him to show up. He did take me out to buy a proper shirt and a couple nice, colorful ties from Brooks Brothers. And that day, I received the Citizen of the Year award. My name was announced at Safeco Field, and I walked across the stage proudly and had my face on the Jumbotron like every kid and adult wants. I was proud of myself, and my memory hears the cheers of friends and cousins, uncles, aunts, and others that were father figures. My dad was there, but his voice is absent. I'm sure he said he was proud, but the memory of that didn't sit in the thick cloud of his absence. At my graduation party, his presence was unnerving. It was decentering, it was distracting, it was embarrassing. I wanted him to know my friends. I wanted him to know their parents. I wanted him to know my young life leaders. I wanted him to know how kick-ass his ex-wife was. And instead, I was embarrassed by his lack of willingness to engage in meaningful ways. I was embarrassed by his obvious avoidance of my mom at her own home. I was embarrassed that he was acting exactly like the absent father that he had been. I was embarrassed by his brief appearance. And I was embarrassed by his inability to be vulnerable, embrace a lack of power, prestige, or control. I was just embarrassed by him. I wanted to be proven wrong, but he proved me right. He proved absent even in the moments that he was present. And this theme of absence has come up as a part of story work I've been doing alongside of coworkers, where we have brought and worked through stories of hurt or trauma that source from our family of origin, our racial identity, and or our sexual harm. We've been encouraged to write out our stories as we have felt them and held them and remembered them, not the stories that were told by others. My childhood memory is fuzzy at best. Ask my wife, ask my twin brother, it's bad. And the narrative that lives in my bones is likely a connection of lived reality, felt reality, photos I've seen, and stories I've heard. And so, when we were encouraged not to write the fact-checked story from the perspective of our parents or our perpetrators, but the story that lived in our bones, the ones that we felt and the ones that we feel, the ones that we believed, this was freeing for me. And I was given permission that I'd never been given before. And nearly every story that I brought forth to these coworkers over the last couple years has dealt with my dad in some way, shape, or form, a father wound. I've been able to bring the narrative that I carry, the narrative that impacts me. So it's worth mentioning that this childhood narrative is different than the narrative of my twin brother, who has a lot of the same memories from a different perspective. It's different than my older sister, different than my mom, and it's definitely be different than my dad. This narrative is mine, and it's proved to be a healthy way and a healing way to approach my patchy memories of my dad, and surprisingly, to find some forgiveness and understanding along the way. A little bit of background context. As I entered into first grade, my professor dad fell in love with another woman and left my dad for the second time, or left my mom for the second time. There's more to that story that angers me, but it's theirs to tell. After a year of weekend swaps in Marysville, the halfway point between SPU campus, where my mom had just started nursing school, and Bellingham, where my dad had worked as a professor, he had moved to Wisconsin after that year, and then Maryland, and then Virginia. We spent summers with him in elementary school, weekends with him in middle school, and just moments with him in high school. The only season of my adolescent life where he wasn't absent was 4 years of college, where my twin brother and I flew across the country and we inserted ourselves in our dad's world. At that time, he was working in upper administration, and we took the chance to get in-state tuition and go out of state. The two of us showing up in his world was unintentional, but I also believe that it was natural, a natural curiosity and a natural chasing. A natural desire for something that I knew was absent and not there. For 4 years, I was able to drop into my dad's office, dance in some of his circles, and discover some admiration for him. There were times in this season that I felt his approval and I felt his pride. I loved science, and I was drawn to chemistry as a major. I did undergrad research. I worked closely with some of his closest friends. I was on the dean's list almost every semester, which was his list. And I won a couple of awards. I felt that I earned his love and approval, and at the same time, I learned that he wasn't going to be a father in the way that I thought I wanted him to be. No deep conversations, no curiosity, little interest in my interests unless they overlapped with his interests. I didn't know what he thought, I didn't know what he felt, I didn't know what hurt him, I didn't know what gave him joy. We weren't playing games, we weren't going fishing. How about a hug? Those things weren't there. And it didn't help that upon graduation, I felt pulled into and giving more of my life to the work that I had volunteered with while in school. And then I put on pause a pursuit of higher education or becoming a science teacher, and instead I took a low-paying job in full-time ministry where I had to raise my own budget and my own support. And sadly, I didn't, and I don't feel my dad's support of that choice or the work that I've deeply committed my life to. His approval and his pride have dissipated, and there have been times that I've even felt in my bones his disapproval. Not because of something that has outwardly or directly been said, but because of the things that have not been said. The missing affirmations, the encouragement, the curious questions. The void causes internal sadness and even frustration that leads to anger and bitterness in me. I'd love to have an open and honest relationship with my dad. I'd love to know what he thinks and what he feels. I'd love to have more understanding of him and him to have an interest in me. But we've fallen into a pattern of occasional emails about the weather, house projects, and what the kids are learning. All surface level stuff, all sitting right here. At times I ask myself how a father could be so careless or so narcissistic to not engage or initiate with a son that desires to have a relationship beyond the weather updates. I do not know, and I do not know that I'll ever know. I don't desire to disparage my dad. He's a good man. He's done some great things. And I believe that he's been the father that he knows how to be. He carries some of his own wounds. And yet, that does not change my reality. His absence during my adolescence is the main root of hurt and pain and harm. But I don't have a single event that drives that narrative. Instead, I just have his absence and a lack of connection. And I carry this wound around with me. We see all the failures of our parents, and we all vow to never be like them, right? And then we end up being like them in some of those ways. So I have a natural fear of letting others down or being absent when my full self is expected. It's that fear that drives me to often give more than I have to offer others. I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. Any other 9s in here? There we go. There's a few of you. Who doesn't want to let others down and wants to keep the peace at all costs. And sometimes that means that I pull people close, and sometimes that means that I keep them at a safe distance. And I do that knowing that I can't take on more, or I just disengage because I can't handle what's happening in front of me. I'm a walking, stretchable chameleon of a person who can be whatever you need me to be. I really can. In part because at all costs, I need to be affirmed and liked and loved and appreciated and trusted and validated, which is a list of things that I believe we should all be receiving from a fatherly figure. Now, while I didn't receive these things from my dad, I did have a wide range of people who stood in that place. My mom, number one, coaches, teachers, parents of friends, young life leaders, and other caring adults. And it's through them that I've been given a picture of God the Father who sees me as his beloved. They affirmed, loved, appreciated, trusted, validated me in ways that allowed me to trust that there is a God who made me and who felt these things at even greater depths. And this God knew everything that was stirring inside of me. So in some ways, my dad's absence has allowed me to become welcoming to God's presence. And it's this presence that has driven me to be present in the lives of middle school and high school kids who crave connection and crave a little bit of everything. I work full-time for Young Life, and there are things that I love and things that I don't love so much. I don't know of many organizations that have the capacity and the potential to create safe spaces for disinterested kids to encounter the blessing and relationship found in Jesus. And I don't know many jobs that would grant me both the structure and the flexibility to work with and in and alongside of schools and families in my community. So after 16 years, I'm still here, still doing the same thing. I'm the paid staff person that holds together a ragtag bunch of volunteers from a wide range of church traditions as we band together to care for kids and to point them to Jesus. As an organization, I'll be honest, we fumble, sometimes intentionally, towards equity, inclusion, and belonging, not unlike the church has done for centuries. And believe me, there's a lot of fumbling that we're doing right now, and I'd be happy to share some of that offline. Just know that right now I happily settle for being the squeaky, agitating wheel that advocates for change and growth so we can be a more open and inclusive ecumenical organization that's safe for all kids and the adults that work with them. And also in my role, I get to be a volunteer leader, so I get to spend a lot of time in the world of kids. I've been an advocate, a fan, a friend, a coach. Sometimes I get to substitute teach. I've been a mentor, and yet I cannot be the best friend that kids need, nor can I be their real or heavenly father. That's not my role. But I often put that pressure on myself to act in those ways. And it's been devastating when I've seen kids expect similar things and then fall flat in reality, the reality that I'm not the solution they're looking for. As my father has been absent, I've collected fatherly figures, so I totally get it. Some were mentors out of necessity, some were because they seemed to have what I desired, and some because they simply believed in me and for me when I could not. Like kids and like all of us, I'm another individual searching for blessing, for approval, and for the love of a father. And it's from this intersection that I do my best to point others to Jesus, knowing that I can't give the person in front of me what they truly need, but Jesus might be able to. In friendships and in relationships and in full-time ministry, I'm a reluctant Jesus proclaimer because I believe that the Spirit should be doing all the heavy work of conviction, internal change, and transformation. I have a master's degree in theology, and yet, if you ask me to sit down and explain who Jesus is, I might fall flat on my face. How do I explain what faith is to me and what is real for me when the more I pray and the more I know, the more I have to be okay with not knowing? And yet, I know the difference it made in my life to have other men and women tell me the story about Jesus' extravagant love. So occasionally, I walk across a bridge of trust and friendship that has been built, and I do the same. I open up my mouth, and I start talking about the person of Jesus. But generally speaking, I just show up, and I trust that any Jesus truth will be communicated non-verbally. I love what I get to do, because I love to offer hope to kids when they see no reason for it. Hope for kids with an absent father figure, hope for kids that are brokenhearted, hope for kids that don't fit in, hope for kids that are pushed out, ignored, overlooked, or forgotten, hope for kids that are on the margins, and hope for kids that are hopeless. Every week that we're here at Salt House, I light a candle over there to your right for a pile of kids that come to mind. Most are no longer kids, some still are. Some have become close friends as adults. Others I haven't spoken to in quite some time. And some are the kids that I'm investing in right now. Whatever wound they're wrestling with, lighting a candle is one way that I hold out hope for each of them and hold space for them in this community. It's one way that I'm reminded that they are not just loved by me, but loved by a God who loves them, sees them, knows them, and desires a relationship with them. And it's one way that I'm reminded of everyone else who has lit a candle of hope for me. People who have affirmed, liked, loved, appreciated, trusted, and validated who I am exactly as I am. People that have helped me see and know the presence of God the Father, who is not absent. He is present, and I am his beloved. My name is Peder Brakke, and this is my Salt House story.